Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 372. With any luck, if this catches you at the right time near release, I should be somewhere in Haneda Airport, probably very, very tired and hopefully pressing the release button so that you can hear this. Nonetheless, this week the questions are taken from Guide 440 and 441 on the armoured cruisers of the Warrior and Ernest Renan classes. That's late-era armoured cruisers. The Wednesday videos on the Battle of the Coral Sea and diving USS Yorktown, and the Friday videos on the second half of the Antony role, and the comparison of the Pearl Harbor and Midway movies in the attack on Pearl Harbor specifically. So let's begin. Hugh Boyd asks, it's curious to see the Warrior with single gun turrets for the main armament. When did twin turrets become the norm for cruisers? And was it adopted quickly by all navies around the same time? And which navy or which ship did it first? So it depends on what kind of cruiser you're looking at. Twin turrets obviously had been a thing on capital ships for a very, very, very long time. I mean, obviously, USS Monitor had a twin turret. Various ironclads of the 1860s had twin turrets. But as far as cruisers are concerned, in the modern sense, armoured cruisers show up with twin turrets starting in the mid-1890s. So the American armoured cruisers have twin turrets from the get-go, and Italian armoured cruisers, for instance, also have twin turrets, as do German armoured cruisers, at least in the mid-1890s. There's a little bit of variance as you go forward in time from that. And for the British, you're looking at the Monmouth class at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, although they're twin 6-inch turrets. Of course, they finish off with the Minotaurs, which will have twin 9.2s. So in terms of armoured cruisers, it starts in the mid-1890s, but the smaller cruisers, the protected cruisers and the light armoured cruisers, generally are all still using single mounts until after the First World War, or more correctly, some ships laid down at the very end of the First World War are the first of what we would recognise to be the ancestor of the light and heavy cruisers of the interwar period to have twin turrets, because obviously the armoured cruiser goes off and kind of dies a death, dash possibly also turns into the battle cruiser. So the main line of cruiser development then doesn't have any twin turrets on it, really. But then you get the laid down in 1918, you have a little bit of a coin toss between the Omaha class, which I would say is the first class of what we recognize as a modern cruiser to be designed from the get-go with twin turrets. But the first ships of the Omaha class are beaten to their keel laying date by HMS Enterprise, which also has a twin turret, albeit that Enterprise is an Emerald class cruiser, which Emerald has just single gun turrets or gun mounts, whereas Enterprise has an experimental twin 6 up front, which will later become the basis of the twin 6 that you find on the Leanders and the Arethuses and various other Royal Navy ships with twin 6-inch. So Enterprise is laid down first, so she technically would be the first of the modern cruisers to have a twin turret, as far as I'm aware, but as I said, it is an experimental, so if you want a full class where it's this is part of the default armament, then it's the Omahas. But that'll be 1918 either way, just when in 1918. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, between cruisers, battleships and carriers, which one had its development hampered the most by the Washington Naval Treaty? I would say definitely not cruisers. Cruisers did end up bumping their heads against the ceiling of the Washington Naval Treaty, but remember when it was signed, very, very, very few cruisers, and to be honest, those that were just about under construction, really, in terms of modern ships at least, were coming even close to that. Most cruisers built up until that point, and some still on the stocks, were well under 10,000 tons. So the fact that you've got a bunch of 10,000-ton cruisers was more about people pushing the limits than their development being necessarily strictly hampered. And of course, there was never a cruiser building suspension window built into the Washington Naval Treaty, so cruiser development could continue throughout the interwar period. So that leaves it between battleships and carriers, and I think you can probably make an argument either way. Battleships, of course, they were capped at displacements that were commensurate with ships that had already been built. And indeed, there were already ships like Hood that had been built and other ships that were well under construction that exceeded the treaty limits, either in terms of gun caliber or displacement or both. So they got reined in. And then, of course, there was the battleship building holiday all the way through to the mid-30s. And that results in you getting fast battleships in the mid to late 1930s, which, although superior, generally speaking, to ships that have gone before them, they're not that much superior. So, and most of that is in terms of speed. So as you see with the final battle between Bismarck and Rodney, with King George V pitching in as well, Rodney is pretty well protected against Bismarck shells and is capable of dealing out the punishment to Bismarck, despite the fact that the two ships are almost 2 decades apart. And modernized ships like Warspite, Queen Elizabeth, and Valiant were, if not necessarily absolute frontline combatants, they could still throw down with a modern capital ship that was vaguely within the treaty limits if they had to. It wouldn't be a walkover. Likewise, Nagato. If Nagato came up against North Carolina or a South Dakota, yes, the more modern ship would have an advantage, but they'd still have to be careful because Nagato could hurt them. Now, you compare that to a similar age gap at the start of World War II, where you'd be having ships like the Pennsylvanias, the Bardens, the Queen Elizabeths and Revenges, and wind the clock back to 1892, 1893, when most of those ships' keels were being laid, and you're talking about late-stage ironclads, not even pre-dreadnoughts at that point. There's not really a contest between those. Or if you fast forward to ships like the Colorado, Nagato, and Nelson, so the early 20s, and you look then back 20 years at the early 1900s, you're looking at kind of second to last generation pre-dreadnoughts. So not even semi-dreadnoughts or close to that. We're just talking standard 4 12-inch gun and roughly 6-inch secondary battery pre-dreadnoughts. They do not stand much of a chance against the 16-inch armed, end of World War II, beginning of 1920s designs. But thanks to the Washington Naval Treaty, modernized or even just well-maintained ships of the early 1920s were still in shouting distance of treaty-compliant ships from the end of the 1930s. So that's quite hampering, but you could potentially also make an argument for carriers, because carriers get limited in very weird ways, because you get the sort of exception built into the treaty for Akagi, Kaga, Lexington, and Saratoga. Then everything's cut down. After that is supposed to be 27,000 tons, and then it's cut to 23,000 tons during the London naval treaties. And it turns out that for a fleet carrier, this is actually really too small. And it doesn't actually matter at that point whether you're going with American-style open hangars and unarmored flight decks or British-style enclosed hangars and armoured flight decks. The simple fact of the matter is that for the identified air group and the whatever protection scheme you've decided on, the treaty-era carrier tonnage limitations simply hold back carrier design, because you have to make massive compromises. If you want an armoured flight deck and an armoured hangar, the style of the British carriers, on the tonnage limits that are available, you have to sacrifice air group. If you're an American carrier and you want a big air group, you have to sacrifice protection. And both the British and the Americans draw up designs that, in theory, meet their primary aim, in the American case air group, in the British case protection, and in the American case have protection, and in the British case still have a large air group. But it turns out that those designs are just a little bit beyond what the treaty limits will allow them to do at the time. And then, of course, you have the Japanese who just go, stuff the treaty limits, we're building the Chicago's, which kind of tells you where carrier design was headed. So, yeah, I think you can make an argument either way for carriers or battleships. Scott asks, Given the large number of funnels on the Erne Renan, would it have made any sense to try and cluster the funnels into a tighter grouping to save deck space for additional armour or weapons? Believe it or not, this is after they've tried to minimise the number of funnels, because something that is perhaps not always appreciated when it comes to funnels on ships is that, of course, every boiler has an output, and that needs to be taken away and stuck up through a funnel. But if you had a funnel for every boiler, you'd end up with a ship that looks a bit like a forest. So you have what's called trunking. And in some cross-sections of ships, you can see this quite a bit of detail. It takes up a surprising amount of space because essentially you have basically an internal funnel drawing off of each boiler, and that goes up for a little bit. And then it has to curve inwards towards the center line, and it has to then merge with other similar funnels or piping or ducting or whatever you want to call it, coming from various other boilers, and that gradually all merges up together into a single flue or uptake, and that is what then emerges out of the deck as a funnel. And so you try and do as much trunking as possible to minimize the number of funnels you have above deck, but there is a limit to what you can do in that regard, because if you go a little bit too overboard, firstly, you'll end up with basically everything above the machinery space and below the main deck just being a massive trunking sloping at a very shallow angle to all try and meet the base of the funnel. And secondly, there is only so much volume within that funnel, or more specifically cross-sectional area, and flow rate is the issue here. So, if you trunk too many boilers into one funnel, you're going to end up with two things. One, there's going to be a pressure build-up because not all the hot air can actually physically escape, which is going to cause problems down in the engine space. And secondly, because if you have optimized the flow already and you've maximized the flow through that specific cross-sectional area of funnel, you're going to end up with basically something that resembles a small jet engine just blasting hot air straight upwards, well, and all the other exhaust gases as well. So in the case of the Erne Renan, yes, she has 6 funnels, and yes, this does occupy a lot of deck space, but those 6 funnels are serving no less than 42 boilers, which means on average, every single one of those funnels you see is actually trunking 7 separate boilers. Jamie Carmen, or possibly Jamaica Man misspell, asks, for a short and concise video on a ship like this with a relatively simple history, how long does it take you to do all the research and decide that this ship is worthy of a video? So there's kind of 2 separate elements there. In terms of deciding is this ship worthy of a video, well, nowadays, for the past, I'd say 2 to 3 years, what I've done for ship videos on a monthly basis is I've tried to run each month on something of a theme. In the sort of first half to maybe 2/3 of the channel's life, it was a case of I was just noting down requests as they came, and you just get a random scatter shot of things. So one week you might get a dreadnought battleship, the next week you might get a destroyer, the next week a carrier, the next week an Asia sail ship, and so on and so forth. But at some point, and I can't remember exactly when, I decided that each month should have some form of theme to it. So I'm still going through the list of requests, but what happens is now I'll get to the next ship on that list of requests, and then I'll go, okay, what is this ship? In terms of what type of ship is it, what time period is it from, etc., etc. So with the ships that are covered in the Saturday videos, the 5-minute guides for this particular Drydock and the one immediately before it, what happened is I got to an armoured cruiser request, and I went, okay, so this is what I would call a penultimate stage armoured cruiser. So it's 1 or 2 classes back from that country's last armoured cruiser. In this case, obviously, with Erne Renan, she's the ship immediately before the Edgar Quinet class, which is the last French armoured cruisers. The Warrior class is just a little bit stepped back from the Minotaur class, and so on and so forth. The York class 1 step back from the Scharnhorsts. And so once I've got that one ship and I know what kind of ship it is, I then look for other ships that match that description. Now, obviously, with armoured cruisers, as Ed Warrior and in York, they're all fairly easy, penultimate armoured cruiser designs. But with other ships, it can be a bit more tricky. So back in August, I did Hartford, Basilisk, and Falca, SMS Falca. So the request was Hartford, which was a steam sloop of the US Navy from the pre-American Civil War period. So I was then going, okay, steam sloops are kind of mid-scale in terms of for their class's size from other navies, and that's where Basilisk and Falca came from. Falca was kind of, well, it's one of the very few that matches in the German Navy, the approximate description. And with Basilisk, there were a few different ships that could kind of meet a similar criteria to Hartford in the Royal Navy's listings. But I recognised Basilisk because she had a little bit of an interesting thing going on there with the towing experiments. And back in July, we were doing post-World War II cruisers, because that request was the Sverdlov, the Soviet post-war cruisers. And so then I was looking around going, okay, well, what else do we have in terms of light cruisers built right at the end of or in the immediate aftermath of World War II? And so I went with, in that case, the Juno class and the De Grasse of the Marine Nationale. And this is, of course, completely separate to the first 5-minute guide each month, which is randomly chosen by patrons. But in terms of how long it takes me to research ship for a 5-minute guide, it can be completely varied. So for something like the Warrior class, the armoured cruisers, that's pretty easy. I know I've got at least 4 or 5 good reference works on British cruisers that will cover that time period, so I can quickly draft up a script and then go through, check I've got all the details right, and then cross-check across a few different sources, and that's nice, done and dusted. But other times, it can actually take quite a long time. So, for example, when I was doing the Rey Don Francisco de Asís, the last Spanish ships of the line, now that was accompanied by other last ships of the line, and those were easier to research. But Rey Don Francisco de Asís and Reina Isabella, there's basically nothing in English about them at all. I mean, there's a couple of very, very small entries on the web which basically say, yeah, these were Spain's last ships of the line, and maybe we'll tell you what the armament is. But that is basically it. And even for a 5-minute guide, which is a little bit over a page of A4, that's nowhere near enough. So in that case, and similar in some other cases, I had to go, okay, this is a ship from Spain. How do I term a search in Spanish to see if there are any reference works in Spanish that will cover this ship? I have a little bit of an in there, particularly because, of course, my mum being a Bolivian, I do have something of an understanding of the Spanish language. But still, I then had to trawl the Spanish internet to see what resources were available that covered that ship, well, those 2 ships, and then, having established that, I then had to go through and try and find reviews of those various sources to figure out which ones were reliable. And then I had to go and purchase them. And in that case, that involved buying 2 different books in Spanish, one from Spanish Amazon and one from a Spanish website, sort of Spanish, I guess, local bookstore website. So both of those then had to be shipped over. That took a few days. I think it took a week in the case of the one from the bookstore. Then I had to find the entries that covered them, and then I had to translate them into English, and then from that I could make the summary for the Rey Don Francisco de Asís and its sister ship, which was, I think all told, was 2 to 3 weeks work off and on just to get that 5-minute guide. Admittedly, a bunch of that was waiting, but still. Right is Right asks, considering that you're a historical purist, does it bother you to have to use a map with the Northern Territory while discussing something that happened before the Northern Territory was a thing and was still part of South Australia? It can be mildly irritating at times, but I do have to make the occasional compromise when it comes to maps, because yes, there are period maps theoretically available, but One, you'd have to find one that is in a high enough resolution. This is in reference to the Coral Sea. Well, my extremely, questionable efforts at MS Paint for some of the Coral Sea video. Yeah, so you've got to find one at high enough resolution to be useful. The labelling's got to be vaguely useful. Sometimes the labelling just gets in the way. And related to that, it's just got to be clear. So as far as I'm concerned, you've got, in this case, the focus is on what's happening at sea. So you know where it is. And to a certain extent, I suppose, using a more modern map, like obviously this one is from Google Maps, that can help people center what's going on and where, because it's obviously familiar to them. The flip side, as you say, of course, is that strictly speaking, the land territories shown are sometimes not entirely accurate. But I would rather have clarity of what's going on the map than use a map that is technically accurate in terms of what province is named what, but is otherwise very messy and very difficult to actually figure out what's happening at sea, which is ultimately, the point of the video in question. The other thing, which I did think about doing at one point, and I think in one or two videos I actually even tried, was to use wireframe maps. So just outline maps. The problem there, once again, actually, was finding high enough resolution wireframe maps that you could zoom in to something even at this scale and, it actually not be completely fuzzy. And secondly, you end up with people asking you to just put the labels back in again anyway, at which point I might as well just use a map that's already got labels on them that people will recognize. You'll notice later on in the same video when I went over to 3D rendering, then I did use a set of basic outline maps just to show where everything was relative to the shipping. But obviously, A, this is an abstract map, and B, because I'd used the more modern maps with the labels on already, then people couldn't really ask me to go labeling every single island because I'd already shown where everything was, what the labels were, etc. So people could relate these grey shapes to what had been shown before. Whereas if I just launched in with just these grey shapes, it would have been a heck of a lot of work to start putting in island labels in Blender for every single one of these islands, or leaving it like this and people are like, oh, well, what's that island? Where is this all happening that isn't clear, etc., etc. Warrant Officer Will asks, could the 27,000-ton armoured flight deck Yorktown you mentioned in your last Drydock have survived Coral Sea? And if either the 27,000-ton Yorktown or Enterprise survived the war, would this upgrade in size have made them more likely to not be scrapped? Well, Yorktown, of course, did survive Coral Sea, but I think you mean did survive Coral Sea undamaged and potentially even survive Midway. In which case, yes, I think it would actually, because if you went with the armoured flight deck Yorktown, the big Yorktown that was considered at one point during the design studies, the Japanese dive bombers are carrying 500 to 550 pound bombs most of the time. That is relatively easy to armour against, and as was shown by the British armoured flight deck carriers, which had armour against 500-pound bombs from basically any altitude and 1,000-pounders as long as they were dropped a little bit lower, then you can reject those kinds of munitions relatively comfortably. So Yorktown obviously needing a bit of a patch-up in the aftermath of Coral Sea, wouldn't have needed that much of a patch-up if she'd been the 27,000-tonner with the armoured flight deck, because that bomb just would have gone splat. There would have been a bit of a dent. Where's someone with a big hammer just to even it all out? But then if you go on to Midway, so working from fore to aft, the bomb that hits Yorktown's forward elevator, admittedly an armoured flight deck isn't going to do much for that, because the elevators would be much less protected, because otherwise you have to have absolutely monstrous gears and motors to lift a massive slab of armour plating that happens to be your elevator. So that damage probably would be much as the same as it was. However, The damage that really did in for Yorktown at Midway was the hit just adjacent to the bridge, where you had the bomb going down, and that caused lots of problems for the machinery, damaging the uptakes and so forth. If you superimposed an armoured flight deck in the British style, not necessarily with armoured hangar size, but just the armoured flight deck profile, that area would be completely protected. And indeed, during the escapades of the British Pacific Fleet, a Japanese kamikaze hit one of the British carriers in almost exactly the same location, right next to the bridge, and basically did nothing. And then the next hit, the one that set a bunch of fires in the hangar, it would have protected against that as well. So, although it was torpedoes that eventually did in for Yorktown, if she'd been the 27,000 tonner with the armoured flight deck, the damage to her engines that knocked her out and caused her to be in the situation where she was eventually hit by incoming Japanese torpedoes wouldn't have occurred in the first place. And likewise, the aircraft torpedoes that kind of come before the submarine torpedoes but after the bomb strikes, well, Yorktown was basically stopped dead in the water by those initial bomb strikes, which, as we've established, wouldn't have stopped her in this case. And she was only able to do about 2/3 of her design speed when those torpedoes came in, whereas if she'd had that armoured flight deck, she would have been motoring along at full speed pretty much the entire time. So she wouldn't have been where she was when the torpedo bombers found her, and even if they found her anywhere else, she would have been going much quicker, and thus A, a harder target, and B, she would have been able to evade better. Now, as far as whether this would have saved either Yorktown or Enterprise post-war, because they would have had more utility, potentially, because a 27,000 tonner with an armoured flight deck would be a lot closer to an Essex class in capabilities than the Yorktowns historically were. They obviously would have accumulated wartime wear and tear and damage, and there would be just a lot of Essexes, whereas even if Yorktown and Enterprise, and even if Hornet also had survived, there's still only 3 of them. So if you've got a big glut of carriers post-war, and your post-war plans say we're only going to run half a dozen or a dozen of them, it makes more sense at that point to just go, okay, we'll run a dozen or half a dozen Essexes, or a chunk of Essexes and some Midways, because they're the big and new ones, rather than 2 or 3 Yorktowns and 2 or 3 Essexes and 2 or 3 Midways. The flip side to that would be that having an armoured flight deck would make that flight deck much, much stronger, therefore able to operate heavier aircraft, and being a 27,000 tonner, she'd also be a little bit larger. So potentially Yorktown at Dash Enterprise may be able to stick around because they may end up actually being able to operate larger and heavier aircraft than the Essex class could. But it could go either way. Elite Corsair asks, can you explain what corn powder is? Is it corn dust or powder, or is it corn-sized gunpowder? It's more towards the latter. So for those of you who watched the 2 videos I did on the Anthony Roll, they talk about, at least on most of the ships, a mixture of what they call serpentine powder and corned powder. And the main difference is that serpentine powder is what at the time is an earlier form of gunpowder, kind of the first form that was used when firearms and artillery began to show up on medieval battlefields. And it's a very, very fine powder. Now, that's great for small handheld firearms and the like, but it is also incredibly volatile comparatively, which means that if you use it in cannon, bad things can happen, and you will have issues in terms of exactly how much of that is kicking your ball down range and how much is just, massively overstressing your gun. So serpentine powder is roughly equivalent to what you might think of as priming powder these days, for those of you familiar with that concept. Whereas the corn powder is a coarser grain of powder, much more suitable for big, heavy artillery, not really suitable for sticking in small handheld firearms, but there you go. And it takes a little bit longer to burn, thus it produces a longer impulse, and thus is better for, big, heavy, long barrel artillery. And obviously, since they've got a mixture of handguns and very small field artillery and then the big field artillery, most ships carry a mixture of serpentine and corn powder. Plus, because serpentine powder is also very good as a priming powder, you'd also use small amounts of serpentine powder to prime your cannon, or even if you're using corn powder as the main charge. Mike Lima 777 asks, when visiting the Mary Rose Museum, there were quite a few crew remains who were believed to come from other parts of the world, such as Spain or Africa. How common was this during the Tudor period? As far as I'm aware, and bear in mind, of course, I'm not a land historian, nor am I a sociologist. I think that's what you would call it. Is it sociology, anthropology, the study of people? They perplex and confuse me for the most part. So that field, I'm not a part of that field. I'm a maritime historian. But with that caveat aside, from what I am aware of, the presence of a fair number of people from, if you like, overseas, as you say, Spain, the Iberian Peninsula generally, various northern African areas, the Mediterranean region, essentially. That was not particularly common in the Tudor period as a whole, but it was reasonably common in larger Tudor warships. And, to be honest, large warships of most nations, as well as some large merchant ships. So allow me to explain. It's basically to do with a combination of skills and mobility. As you would have gathered from the video, gunner was not person who is manning the guns. Gunner was actually, at that point, a very, very skilled position. You were essentially the gun captain. You were the one who knew how to operate this newfangled technology. And that kind of skill was rare, highly valued, and very often sold to the highest bidder by the possessor of that knowledge. And that meant you basically took almost anyone you could get from anywhere who had a half-decent reputation and wasn't going to sell you out at the next moment. And given that these were large warships with lots of guns, you'd have more field artillery on one big warship like the Mary Rose or Henry Gracedieu than you would have in most armies. You had a very high concentration and high demand for certain very niche skills on these warships. And thus, you couldn't afford to be picky. If there was a ex-Algerian corsair who was now plying a marginally more honest trade in Northern Europe, and he knew how to operate guns, well, as long as you're not demanding too outrageous a price, that will get you a gunner. And the thing is, if you don't employ him, your opponent will. The French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the various city-states that would eventually make up Germany, the Hanseatic League, etc., etc. Someone would employ them, so you might as well be the one to do that. And the same thing with certain types of experienced sailor, because let's face it, a ship the size of Mary Rose was not common in the Tudor period. There were a fair number of them around, but compared to the number of ships in general, they really were quite rare. And again, as such, if there's a very experienced sailor in port who's looking for a job and, well, you need quite a few experienced sailors on your ship, again, he can find employment in many places. Best to get him on your ship. There's also a certain matter of reliability in terms of how long you'd actually want them in service, because somebody from, let's say, the Mediterranean area generally, if they've wound up in Tudor England, it suggests that either they don't have particularly strong connections back home, or if they do, they don't mind being away from them from years at a time, usually. So if you say, hey, I'd like to employ you to be the gunner, the fighting top commander, or whatever other position on my big royal warship, which comes with decent pay, they'll probably say fine, and they'll probably sit around for as long as you want them to, within reason. Whereas if you employ someone from, let's say, Plymouth, and you say, right, you're going to come and you're going to be Master at Arms on the Mary Rose, they'll be like, yeah, great, fantastic. Oh, by the way, did I mention the Mary Rose is in Portsmouth? And it's going to stay there for quite a while. Someone's probably going to go back to their family. And Plymouth and Portsmouth back then were a lot further away in terms of travel time than they are these days. So weirdly, having foreign sailors and gunners in your employ might actually be a somewhat more stable and reliable proposition for you as the Royal Navy as compared to some of the local sailors. And you see this in other navies as well. For example, during the Spanish Armada, when I believe it's the Rosario blows up, one of the more commonly purported accounts of why that happens is the Spanish captain abusing a German gunner who is in charge of one of the guns on the Rosario until the German gunner just goes, stuff this, I don't have to put up with this, sets fire to a barrel of powder and jumps over the side, leaving the ship to blow itself half to pieces. So yeah, ultimately, when it comes to the age of sail, there's remarkably little discrimination in most of the age of sail navies. I mean, it depends nation to nation, but certainly in the English, later on British navies during the age of sail, compared to what you might expect from all the various tropes, it really didn't actually matter too much where you were from. Sailors would accept you as long as you could pull your shift and had valuable skills. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, it's often mentioned that the US carriers not being at Pearl Harbor was key to their survival. But is this entirely true? While they no doubt would have sustained damage if they had been present, would it have been enough to sink them? And if so, would it have been possible for them to have been salvaged like many of the standard battleships were? Or would the carriers have been a total loss like Arizona? I think it was actually quite important for, I would say, probably three primary reasons. Firstly, or no particular order, but firstly, if they'd been hit, then either the flight crews would have been aboard or not. And if they were, then those ships almost certainly would have been dive bombed, possibly level bombed as well. And there would have been quite a lot of casualties amongst the flight crew. If they weren't aboard, then they probably would have done their level best to get into the air, and they would have been at various US air bases, so there's a good chance that they would have suffered significant casualties there from strafing zeros and so forth. Now, while, yes, the US did, as it turns out, have a better infrastructure to replace lost aircrew as time went forward, part of that relied on existing veteran aircrew being rotated back to, pass on their experience and knowledge. If a good chunk of the US Pacific Fleet's pre-war trained aircrews get wiped out or injured on December 7th, then regardless of anything else going into the future, you've essentially reset the score to count or the timer to zero in terms of gaining aircrew experience. So there are going to be less experienced aircrews going out there, therefore they're going to suffer higher casualties, not necessarily get as good results, and essentially set you back at least a cycle or two on the training of new aircrew, which obviously is bad. In terms of would they have taken enough damage to sink them? Yeah, almost certainly. I mean, one of the things you've got to remember is that the Japanese had an entire segment of their attack aircraft dedicated purely to taking out the carriers. And when they weren't there, obviously poor old Utah got a bunch of the ordnance that was meant for them. But some other ships were hit as well, but then those aircraft then went and swung round and came back again on Battleship Row. So if there had been carriers moored on the opposite side of Ford Island, there was a whole bunch of Japanese aircraft dedicated purely to hitting them, so they would have been hit repeatedly and almost certainly would have gone down. Would it have been possible to salvage them like the battleships were? In theory, yes. I mean, the upper works, the hangar, etc., were more lightly built than the majority of the hull of a battleship. So potentially there would have been more damage, but potentially it might have been quicker and easier to rebuild. But also they may have taken more structural damage as a whole, keeling over. So you could, I think, probably have brought them back, assuming they didn't go full Oklahoma and flip over. The larger problem, though, would be that whether they're badly damaged, completely unsalvageable, or very badly damaged and sunk, but still technically salvageable, whatever the case, it would deny the US immediate access to a good chunk of their carrier fleet. Not all of it, because obviously they did bring in ships from the Atlantic fleet pretty quickly, but with a much, much smaller number of carriers, the US Navy would have to play a lot more defensively and a lot more cautiously. And at that point, the loss of even one or two additional carriers could have put the US in a position of not having really any operational carriers available at all. And that actually has significant effects on what the Japanese would be doing, because the Japanese are playing a little bit of a game of ping pong during their period of advance, because they're having to constantly worry about what are the US carriers doing. Obviously, the US are mounting various carrier raids, the Doolittle mission, and other operations, as well as things like the Battle of Coral Sea. If the US has, let's say, only 2 carriers available to it, period, and one of them gets torpedoed, as Saratoga did historically, outside of the context of the Pearl Harbor attack, so they've only got the 1 fleet carrier, they can't do the Doolittle raid. I don't think you'd really find them risking doing raids on enemy-held territory with their sole operational fleet carrier. And that means the Japanese can actually concentrate on using the Kiru Butai on a far more sustained basis against other targets, either facilitating a more rapid advance into the Southwest Pacific or Southeast Asia, and perhaps a more prolonged campaign in the Indian Ocean or something like that. And stuff like the invasion convoy to Port Moresby almost certainly gets through, because there just wouldn't be a battle of the Coral Sea, because it's just not worth risking it again with just a single carrier around. And all of this happens pretty quickly. So even if we were talking about carriers damaged and maybe settled upright rather than rolled over and sunk, they're still not going to be around for that period. Tanko Dromis asks, the refit of HMS London was not ideal, and other county class did not get such major refits before World War II. How would you make a better refit for London, and would it be any different from the ideal refit for a county class pre-World War II? Perhaps something similar to how the Surrey class looks in World of Warships? The Surrey class, as seen in World of Warships, is kind of a halfway house between the original county designs and the London refit. Historically, the Surrey was going to be a continuation of the Norfolk subclass of the county class, and it was going to have more armour than the existing county class, but it would sacrifice speed to do so. Now, if you look at the Surrey class here, and then you compare it with London before and after, you can see the main visual distinction is that with the Surrey class in World of Warships, they've chosen to retain the aft aircraft handling facilities. They've still got the twin funnels that London does, but without the big hangar up front. And as a result, the anti-aircraft battery on London is concentrated after the funnels, whereas on the Surrey, it's abreast of the funnels. I would say the Surrey is probably closer to what I would do, but I would do a few things differently. You'll also note the Surrey has deviated from the county class's flush deck approach. It's cut down the quarterdeck to save a bit of weight. Now, I would agree with the World of Warships Surrey class's plans, just have the big forward superstructure, not also the hangar. But I wouldn't go with the extra trunking that both Surrey and London's refit had, trunking everything into 2 funnels, because, well, all that additional trunking was part of the big problem. I'd keep the 6 twin 4-inch abreast the funnels the way that the Surrey does, but then where the Surrey has a fairly complicated aircraft handling facility aft mirroring the original county one that you can see here, I would actually rebuild the entire aft superstructure, so incorporate the main mast, which is basically just a pole mast, into the aft superstructure, perhaps move that a little bit forward, so the aircraft handling and launching facility is actually part of that aft superstructure, with the aircraft actually positioned behind the main mast. And then I'll have my secondary fire control forward of said main mast, all part of that aft superstructure, and then run a kind of spinal ridge of superstructure down towards the back end of the funnels. And then on top of that spinal ridge, I'd put a couple of quad or octuple pom-poms, depending on what the weight can withstand. And then either side of that superstructure, so we're talking forward of the aft superstructure but behind the funnels, I would then either put an additional pair of twin 4-inch or some more pom-poms, again depending on what weight allows. And the aircraft handling facilities would be very minimal, just maybe enough to use a Sea Fox or something like that. A Walrus would be ideal, but I'll go with a Sea Fox if it means I can save weight to have more anti-aircraft firepower midships. And for the belt, I'd go for the deepened armour belt that was planned for the second batch of the counties. Chris Knight asks, not too long ago you did a 5-minute guide on CSS Hunley. On one of your future visits to the US, do you plan to visit the Hunley in Charleston, where it's being preserved similar to the artefacts from USS Monitor? It is definitely on my list of places to visit when I manage to recommence visiting the US. That's not going to happen this year, but maybe next year, we'll see. Dr. D.M. Platt asks, if you were to compare the number of naval fights between warships of any size, from launchers and motorboats through battleships and carriers in 1942, compared to naval fights between armed launches through first rates in the busiest years of the Napoleonic Wars, which year contained more combats, and which year was more typical of naval combat during wartime since 1600, including both privateers and submarines? Honestly, I don't know, because if we're extending it all the way down to launchers and motorboats or sloops and brigs, depending on the time period, there's a huge, huge swathe of combats that could occur. I mean, look at the War of 1812, for example. Most people who've heard of the War of 1812 at all have heard of the big fights between the American and British frigates. Then perhaps some more, or a few less maybe, will have heard of the fights on the Great Lakes. But even when you look at the Great Lakes, people will know about the big battles, but all the small skirmishes, attempted landings, and the back and forth that backstop those big battles, now still fewer people know about it. Then you go into, well, what were things like the Enterprise, the Wasp, and the Hornet doing in the War of 1812? A lot of people who might know about Constitution versus Guerriere or something like that might not even realise that such vessels were part of the War of 1812, that being Wasp and so forth. And even those who do know about it, well, now you get down another level, all the various privateers. Who were they? What were they doing when they encountered warships, when they didn't encounter warships, etc., etc. And then, of course, you've also got the other issue of when you're looking at all of those ships, you've said specifically fights between warships of any size, but does that include fights with perhaps armed merchantmen that are part of a convoy escort or just acting on their own? Because a fight with a heavily armed East Indiaman, if you're a brig, might actually be a bit more of a challenge than fighting another similar-sized brig. But then do you count that as a fight between two armed war vessels, or do you count that as a fight between a warship and a merchant ship? And that's just looking at the War of 1812. All of that is happening at a much larger scale at the same time over the other side of the Atlantic and across the planet as the British are fighting the French. So, as I said, honestly, I don't know. When you look at the records for various naval actions in the Napoleonic Wars, which I suspect will probably be where you'll find the single largest number of combats, simply because of the sheer number of ships and their distributed nature across the various fleets involved, my suspicion is that you're probably looking at somewhere between 1810 and 1813, because although you might be tempted to think earlier, because that's when the Spanish were also on the side of the French, and therefore there's more enemy naval ships for the British to go after, for some reason, around about 1810, there's a very sharp increase in the number of frigate actions that are recorded, and that is generally, while not completely a barometer, it's at least indicative of overall enemy naval activity. Now, there aren't any big fleet actions in 1810 through 1813, the way that obviously there is for Trafalgar or the Nile and so forth. But even something the size of Trafalgar is only going to count as one fight, whereas, two actions between frigates, immediately that's worth twice as much as even that big fight in this method of measuring things. So I would suspect it's probably either 1810, when the French seem to show a big resurgence in small ship actions, or possibly 1813, because 1813, there's a huge amount going on with the War of 1812. There is stuff going on the Great Lakes, there's frigate duels, there's all the brigs and sloops running around, And there's still a substantial amount of action coming out of the French Navy. Whereas when you go to 1814, a good chunk of the American fleet is blockaded in, and 1814 marks the first fall of Napoleon. So there's a cessation of French naval activity and a significant downturn immediately beforehand as well during that time period. The thing is, if you wind significantly further back to something like the Anglo-Dutch Wars, most of the fleets are concentrated in much larger numbers, much closer to home. And even if you look at something like the 7 Years' War, where everybody's pretty much fighting everybody, I don't think there's quite the same level of small ship action that you get in the Napoleonic Wars. At least that's my impression. And then once you get past that time period, basically the number of combatants on each side never quite matches that level. Now, yes, you can point to World War II and the thousands upon thousands of vessels on the rosters of the British and American navies, and hundreds that are on the rosters of the Japanese. However, when you look a little bit closer, the vast majority of those are going to be things like landing craft and so forth that are never going to fight an action with an opposition warship. Once you've nailed it down to the actual armed vessels, cruisers, destroyers, battleships, aircraft carriers, PT boats, etc., then they tend to clump together in much larger numbers so that any individual fight is going to be just one fight, but perhaps involving multiple craft. And two, those numbers of commissioned warships are actually much closer, or in some cases actually below, the numbers of warships that you'd have in the Age of Sail, which will tend to be a little bit more distributed. And of course, it's all very well the British and the Americans having thousands of ships on their roster if the other side only has a few hundred on their roster. The opportunities for combat are somewhat more limited. The Rogue Chief asks, what were lighthouses and lightships doing in wartime? On the one hand, you don't want your own forces running aground, but on the other, you don't want to offer a literal beacon to help enemy forces navigate their way to your most valuable positions. Now, I don't know as much detail about what happened in, say, German-occupied Europe and Germany, but for the UK at least, lighthouses and lightships had a bit of a mixed bag as far as, their continued activity. Some were switched off altogether. Some had their lights dimmed, so you'd only see them at particularly close range. And still others were actually put on timers, not as in, someone just plugged a timer into the wall, although one or two were electrically operated, so you theoretically could have done, but they were given schedules of when they could be on, and obviously if they were on, whether they were to be on full power or whether they were to be dimmed. A number were actually painted up in camouflage because obviously as navigation markers they're valuable for British ships, so the Luftwaffe did occasionally try to bomb them. And the reason you've got this particular picture is because one of the Goodwin lightships was in fact bombed and sunk by the Luftwaffe while at its station. And so how they determined which lighthouses and lightships would be on, off, or timed, or whatever, and how dim or bright they needed to be, essentially came down to what was needed for wartime shipping. Because obviously in peacetime, you'd have merchant ships of all sorts plying up and down the coast at all hours of the day and night. Whereas in wartime, there were some coastal shipping elements, but the vast majority of merchant shipping was then being organized into convoys. So if you knew that no merchant ship of yours, or indeed warship of yours, was likely to be using a particular area of the coast, especially during nighttime, then those were the kind of lighthouses that you could just switch off because, well, there shouldn't be anybody there to actually need their services. Now, of course, ships might sail past that, but perhaps you know that the coastal convoys are scheduled to always come past that part of the landscape during the day. The dimmed ones would, of course, be ones which were pretty permanently needed. Perhaps there's, the few kinds of shipping that could go in and out at any time, like fishing trawlers and so forth. Plus, convoys might have to run past that area in dark or light conditions. So those would stay on, but dimmed, so that you only really see them up close and personal. Another function, of course, is if you switch off a lighthouse, then you might be able to perhaps mine the area and lure the enemy in that way because they don't know exactly where they are. And then the ones that are timed would be perhaps ones that are in sensitive locations where you don't want shipping to generally be, but you know that there is going to be shipping there at specific points. So, for example, if there's a particular headland and you know that most of the time shipping is going to go past there during the day, then it might be switched off. But if you know that every second Tuesday at 10 p.m. there's going to be a convoy that's coming in from somewhere and it only can sail at that particular time and it has to come past at night, well, then you might have that lighthouse due to switch on a dim setting every second Tuesday or something like that. Geoffrey Conley asks, how different would the Crimean War be if all the fleets were made of ironclads? To a certain degree, I think it depends on what kind of ironclads we're talking about. So are we talking about somebody inventing ironclad warships a decade ahead of time, and there's been some absolutely colossal rebuilding effort? So essentially, you're looking at the ironclad fleets of the mid-1860s, only now in the 1850s. Are we talking about somebody just slapping iron plate onto wooden hulls and creating a bunch of gloire-alikes? Are we talking about perhaps throwing into the mix some very basic casement-style ironclads like you see in the American Civil War, which wouldn't necessarily be out of place in and around the Crimean Peninsula? Or are we talking about somewhat later ironclads where they're abandoning the general broadside batteries for fewer but heavier guns like the Barbette Monitor - Coast Harbour Defence Vessel Cerberus, which you can see here. Now, if we take the most simplistic approach, which would be a mixture of the ironclad floating batteries that you see towards the end of the Crimean War, along with perhaps early 1860s level ironclads, then I think the Crimean War overall might actually have finished sooner, because the Russians are still not going to want to come out and play, because they're massively outnumbered, and if we assume that commensurate levels of armament are coming with these ships, well, that means that the Russians can't hurt the British and most of the French ironclads. Now, granted, the French can't hurt the Russian ironclads either, unless the Russian ironclads are of significantly worse quality, which is possible given how the Russians were a little bit behind on that curve. The only ones who are reliably protected against pretty much anything anyone can throw at them, assuming we're talking about like 1865-ish era ironclads displaced back 10 years, are the British, because, well, they've got guns that can penetrate most armour, even if only just, and they've also got the best armour. So the Russian fleet is very definitely still staying in port. However, when you get to things like the bombardment of Sevastopol, now instead of some slightly older school sail-only warships having to be towed in and out of bombardment, and even the steam-powered ones, gradually accumulating damage as they batter the forts, these ironclads on the Anglo-French side can just motor on up to the Sevastopol fortifications pretty much as they please and hammer away essentially until they get bored, because there's precious little the Russians can do to stop them or really significantly hurt them. And that could lead also to all sorts of interesting things, like taking some of the more heavily protected ironclads and just running them into Sevastopol harbour to deliver either bombardment or troop assaults and so forth, things like this. So with a much more weather-independent fleet and the capability of using it far more aggressively, I think the Anglo-French forces would use their fleets far more aggressively to influence the tide of battle and shut things down a lot faster. And lastly for this week, Ian Carr asks, why does the name of the World War II Town class get used as such, and where does it come from, given that they're all actually named after British cities? I think it comes from a number of disparate elements. Firstly, the lead ship of the first of the three subclasses was the Southampton, and Southampton, of all the ships in the Town class, was not a city. Southampton only became a city in the 60s, so Southampton was a town, officially, at that point. And while some of the ship names, like Sheffield and Manchester, were new, the majority of the names used in the Town class were actually obviously ships that had been in the service with the Royal Navy before, most of them with the previous World War I Town class, and also in various iterations going back to the 19th century and before that still. And given that most of the places that are technically actually cities that Town class cruisers were named for got their city status in the latter part of the 1800s, when these names were first used in the Royal Navy, almost all of those names were reflective of towns rather than cities. One or two were pretty much permanently cities under the old school categorization of if you had a major university or a cathedral, you were a city no matter how large the actual conurbation was. But I think basically you're looking at those two factors and the fact it's a nice, useful way of putting them all together, because at the time, officially, they weren't referred to as Town class. They were referred to as, well, if anything, Southampton class. And if people were getting picky with the subclasses, then of course you'd have Gloucesters and so forth. But in most writings, including, for example, Admiral Cunningham's, you'll see them referred to actually as Southamptons. But then later on, the Town acronym kind of picks up because it's easier to say Town class divided into the Southampton, Gloucester, and Edinburgh subclasses than it is to say, well, this is a Southampton class cruiser and this is a Gloucester class cruiser, because while it's easier to distinguish between the Edinburghs and their predecessors, trying to explain to the average reader what exactly the differences are between a Southampton and a Gloucester, just looking at them at face value, can be pretty difficult. Now, of course, if you get into the technical details, it's very easy to point out the subtle differences. But for general publication, I think most people just shrug their shoulders and went, we're calling it Town class, because then everyone knows, oh yeah, those are the 12-gun, 6-inch cruisers that the Royal Navy built that all look vaguely similar. And that wraps us up for this week. Thank you very much for listening, everyone, and I hope to see you again in another video soon. Bye for now.